This is the second in a three-part series of webinars on developmental assessments for children from birth to 3. This webinar is part 2, and we'll be covering the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, Words and Gestures. I'm Allison Setti with the Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind and the University of Colorado Boulder. If you have any questions about today's webinar, you can feel free to email me at the address listed below. So today I'll be talking about the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, often abbreviated CDI. I'll be describing the assessment, talking about the instructions for administration of the assessment. I'll tell you a little bit about an opportunity for families of children who are deaf or hard of hearing to participate in a project called Kneecap. And we'll be spending some time talking about how to interpret and use the results that you get from the MacArthur. The MacArthur Communicative Development Inventories have two different assessments. The one we're discussing today is the words and gestures. There's a companion assessment for children who are older that is called Words and Sentences, and that assessment will be covered in our next webinar, Part 3. The Words and Gestures Inventory is appropriate for children who are between 8 and 18 months of age. The assessment can also be used with older children who have language delay. So for example, if you're working with a child who's 24 months of age, but their language level is in the 8 to 18 month range, this assessment would be appropriate for them. In trying to determine if this is the right assessment to use with an older child, think about the size of the child's productive vocabulary, which could be either in spoken language and/or in sign language. If you're working with a girl and their vocabulary size is approximately 70 words or less, then Words and Gestures is the appropriate assessment to use. If you're working with a boy and you would estimate that their vocabulary size is less than 50 words, again, this would be the assessment you would choose. If you felt that the child you're working with has a vocabulary size larger than this, then you would switch over to the next level of the assessment, which is called Words and Sentences. Again, that assessment will be covered in Part 3 of this webinar series. The Words and Gestures Inventory assesses 5 different developmental areas, all in the area of language and communication. It looks at the comprehension of phrases, so how well is the child able to understand short phrases like be quiet, it's time to go, get up. It also looks at vocabulary comprehension, so comprehension of single words. It looks at expressive vocabulary, either in spoken language or in sign language. And it has a list of 396 words that a parent will examine and check off which words their child can say and/or sign. There's a section on the Words and Gestures test that looks at communicative gestures. So things like waving goodbye, nodding your head yes, putting your index finger to your lips to say shh, be quiet. It also has a section for more advanced symbolic gestures and pretend play skills. So things like combing a doll's hair, pretending to feed a stuffed animal, using a vacuum, that sort of thing. The published version of this test is available from Brooks Publishing Company. The published version of the test is available either in English or in Spanish. And it's one of the few tests available for this age range where not only is the instrument translated into Spanish, but actually the instrument was developed for Spanish-speaking children and has separate norms for the Spanish-speaking population. So the English version and the Spanish version are actually somewhat different in terms of the gestures that are on the test, the symbolic play that's on the test, and the actual words that are on the test. So the Spanish version is not a direct translation of the English version, and you are not comparing Spanish-speaking children to English-speaking children when you look at the test norms. That's one of the nice things about this instrument, and again, this is unusual for assessments for the birth-to-3 population. We've adapted the published version of the Words and Gestures test at the University of Colorado Boulder. This adaptation has been done for children who may use sign language. This could be a child who's deaf or hard of hearing, or it could be a child who uses sign as an augmentative communication system. Sometimes the signs are used by children who have Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, autism, and other developmental delays. We've adapted the form by adding a column where the parent can distinguish between words that their child says and words that their child signs. And in just a minute, I'll show you what that adaptation looks like. This adaptation is helpful if you're wanting to get a handle on the vocabulary that's spoken by the child, the vocabulary that's signed, and words that may be produced with both speech and sign. The University of Colorado's adapted version is also available in either English or in Spanish. Let's take a look at a page from Words and Gestures. This page gives you an example of the vocabulary section. You can see that the words are divided into different semantic categories. So on this page, we have words that are vehicles, either toys or real vehicles, like a car, a train, a motorcycle. We have a section for toys, such as ball, doll, book. And we have a section on this page for food and drink. So words like apple, cookie, orange, toast. And you can see next to each word there are 3 bubbles. The parent would check the first bubble if they feel their child understands a given word. They would check the second bubble if their child says a particular word. And they would check the third bubble if the child signs a word. So for a child who's using a combination of spoken language and sign language, you may see that some of the words are only spoken, so they only check says. Some words are only signed, and so they only check signs. And some words may be produced in both spoken and sign language, so they may be checking both of those bubbles. Let's take a look at another page of the MacArthur. This is part of the gesture section, and in particular, it's looking at some of the more advanced symbolic gestures. So there's a section here that's called Action with Objects. So it's looking at things such as, does the child know how to put on a hat, put on shoes? And what they're really looking for here is not skill in a motor sense, but the cognitive knowledge of what to do with items. So the parent should be checking yes, as the instructions say, if the child either does or tries to do any of the following. They don't necessarily have to do them with perfect execution. So it's everything from throwing a ball to sniffing a flower, putting on a hat. So in other words, demonstrating knowledge that they know what to do with certain objects. The section right below that is starting to look at pretend play skills. So it's asking the parent to indicate if they've ever seen their child do any of these items either with a stuffed animal or with a doll. Things like feed it a bottle, pat it, put it to bed, kiss it, that sort of item. So that's looking at the symbolic play skills. The adapted version that was done at the University of Colorado has not added any items or changed items in any way. The only adaptation is to add a column where parents can indicate if a word was signed versus spoken. If you're interested in getting a copy of our adaptation, feel free to contact me at the email address that was at the beginning of this presentation. This particular assessment is designed to be completed by the child's parent or other caregiver. If you wish, you can just rely on the instructions that are on the front of the test form. When this test was normed, it was sent to thousands of families, and there were no additional instructions other than what was on the test form. So it's perfectly fine if you feel a family will be able to read and understand the instructions, to hand them the form, ask them to read the instructions, and complete the form. Typically, in an early intervention context, because it does take some time for the family to go through the form, think about the words, and complete it, therapists generally and teachers generally leave the form with the family and let them know that they'll pick it up the next week or 2 weeks when they're back to visit them again. If you wish, you can provide some supplemental instructions to the family. You can do this either by describing the instructions to them verbally or presenting some supplemental instructions in writing. And I have an example here of something that you might want to give them. And again, you're welcome to contact me if you would like these instructions. One of the items that you might want to go over with the family when you're giving them instructions is number 3 on this supplemental instruction sheet. You want to make sure that the family only marks a word that a child says or signs if the child can produce that word spontaneously. So in other words, if they only imitate the word after somebody else says it, then that item should not be marked. Another thing to clarify with parents is number 4 on the instruction sheet. It's fine to mark a word as being produced even if the child misarticulates it or doesn't produce the sign perfectly accurately. So for example, if the child says nana instead of banana, or says baba instead of bottle, it's fine to mark the word, as long as that's the way the child produces the word consistently and it's so in a form that at least the mother or father understands. Another thing you can mention to a family is number 5 on this list, which is that if a child produces a word that means exactly the same thing as the word on the list, it can also be marked. So for example, there's a word on the inventory which is soda. If the child says pop or soda pop, they can go ahead and get credit for soda. Or if a child says owie instead of boo-boo, they could get credit for the word boo-boo. It's also fine to ask other people in the child's world to contribute to the form. There may be words a child uses in certain contexts, maybe at school or with the nanny or with the father, that they don't necessarily use with other people, such as the interventionist or the mother. So many people can contribute to filling the form out. Once the family has completed the form, you're going to want to check for anything that is inconsistent with your observation of the child, and use it obviously as a learning opportunity either for you or potentially for the family. It may be that once you discuss the item with the family more, you find out that the child uses words with them that they may not necessarily use when you're there. Or you may find that the parents have misunderstood something about the form. Perhaps they're marking words that the child only imitates rather than says spontaneously, or marks a word that isn't even a close production of the actual word on the list. Or there may be some misunderstanding regarding what's meant by signs. For example, I gave this recently to a family who was a Spanish-speaking family. This is a family whose child has a unilateral hearing loss. The child, as far as I knew, didn't know any sign language, and the parents don't know any sign language. When I got the form back, I saw that they had marked about 100 words that the child signed. When I spoke to the mother further about this, she told me that he pointed at those words, and she thought that the sign column, that's what that meant. So once I clarified with her, I was able to basically negate 100 words that were on the list that would have had a really dramatic effect on the child's age score. So it's very important to look through the form, make sure it matches with what your picture is of the child, and if it's not, come to terms with the family in terms of what would be the most accurate way to represent the child's vocabulary. The way this test is scored is two different possibilities. If the child's chronological age, so the child's actual age, is within the range of the test, so in other words, if the child is somewhere between 8 and 18 months of age, you'll be able to obtain percentile scores by looking at the normative tables in the manual. If you give this to an older child, a child above 18 months of age, who's demonstrating language delays, so perhaps this is the appropriate form, but the child is older than the children who the test was normed on, you'll be able to obtain age scores. You do that by looking at the 50th percentile line on the normative table, matching up your child's raw score with the 50th percentile line, and looking to see the age of a child that typically produces or understands that many words or makes that many gestures, depending on what subscale you're looking at. You can also get these age scores for children who are within the 8 to 18 month stage. Speaking of scoring the assessment, if you want an opportunity for somebody else to score it for you, you could consider joining a project that is going on through the University of Colorado at Boulder. The project is called Kneecap, which stands for the National Early Childhood Assessment Project. This project is assisting interested states and agencies in administering two different developmental assessments. The first assessment is the Minnesota Child Development Inventory. That assessment was described in part 1 of this webinar series. The second developmental assessment is the MacArthur, which we're describing in this webinar, and we'll be describing the second instrument within the MacArthur in our next webinar. The Kneecap project is specifically for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. As I said, the assessments are sent to the University of Colorado Boulder and are scored by personnel at the university. A report is then sent back to you and the family with the child's results, and the participating state or agency receives an annual report of the results of all of the children in that state or agency that can be used for accountability purposes. If you're the administrator of a state or agency level program and you're interested in learning more about the Kneecap project, you can feel free to contact me at the address below. Let's talk a bit about interpreting the results that you'll get from the MacArthur Communicative Development Inventory. One of the things you're going to want to do is compare the child's scores on the various subscales. Remember, the Words and Gestures form has 5 subscales. There's the comprehension of phrases, comprehension of words, production of words, and production of communicative gestures and symbolic gestures. Children who are developing typically generally show more or less equivalent scores across all of those sections. So their nonverbal communication skills are on par in terms of age level with their linguistic communication skills. Another thing you'll want to look at is the scores in comprehension relative to production. For children who have language delays, if the delays exist in both comprehension and production, those are more significant than delays that are only in production. Often very young children whose comprehension is good and is at age level, but who are producing very few words for their chronological age, will catch up. Those children are often what are termed late talkers. They're a little slower to develop productive language, but they do catch up and are on par with their age-level peers. Children who have delays in both comprehension and production create more of a red flag situation and typically will require intervention to bring their language up to age level. Let's take a look at a sample summary sheet so I can show you what results you'll get from the test, and so we can look at this idea of looking across subscales and looking at scores in comprehension compared to scores in production. This is a summary sheet for Emma. This is a summary sheet that would be prepared for you if you were part of the Kneecap project, and is something that you could prepare for yourself if you were independent from the project. You'll see at the top it says that Emma is 18 months of age. That's her chronological age. Her age scores on the various subscales are along the right-hand side of the paper. So we can see section B. She understood 17 of the phrases on the form. That equated to an age score of 13 months. Going down to section D, we see she understood 79 words, which was an age score of 12 months. She produced 7 words, which is an age score of 12 months. And then if we look at the bottom of the page, we see the gesture section. The early gestures are the communicative gestures, like shaking your head no, nodding your head yes, waving goodbye. She was able to do 12 of those gestures, which equated to an age score of 12 months. The later, more symbolic gestures, she received an age score of 13 months. So if we look across the subscales, as I suggested earlier, we see a very even pattern of development. All of the subscales she's scoring somewhere in the 12 to 13 month range. That's typical of children who are developing typically. However, in her case, all of the scores are depressed relative to her chronological age, which remember is 18 months. So her pattern of development is very even across both comprehension and production, across gestures and linguistics, but all of them are depressed relative to chronological age. We'll come back to her shortly. One of the other things you want to look at the summary sheet is the child's ability in the gesture domain versus the linguistic domain. So in other words, what is their age score on those early communicative gestures and the later symbolic gestures relative to their age score on the phrases understood, the words understood, and the words produced. Looking at the gesture score can give you some indication of the child's more general cognitive ability or their general thinking skills. Children whose cognition and thinking skills are within the average range will typically produce nonverbal gestures to communicate on par with age level. Even children who have hearing loss, who sometimes show linguistic delays, generally, if they have no other disabilities, will have nonverbal gestures commensurate with hearing peers. So when you look at the gesture score, if the gesture score is low relative to chronological age, that should put up a red flag for you in terms of the child's cognition. Certainly just based on the gestures, you'd never want to jump to conclusions about a child's cognitive ability, but it might be something you want to investigate further if you see the gesture score is low. Once you look at the gesture score, you should have a vague idea of the child's cognitive skills. You can then look at that age level and compare it to the language scores. For children who are developing typically, their language scores will be very similar to their cognitive ability. Children with language delay, on the other hand, will have gesture or cognitive scores that are relatively high, language scores that are lower. Let's take a look again at Emma in that regard. Emma's gesture scores are in the 12 to 13 month age range. We see that at the bottom of the summary sheet. Comparing that to her linguistic scores, which are at the top of the summary sheet, those are also 12 to 13 months. So although she seems to be globally delayed and may have overall developmental delays, her language is where it is at where we would expect it to be relative to her thinking skills or her cognitive skills. Let's take a look at another child. This is John. John is 15 months old. We can see that up at the top of the summary sheet. If we look down at the bottom of his gesture skills, his age scores are all in the 15 to 16 month range. That's exactly the same as his chronological age. So we don't have any red flags at this point for John in terms of his thinking skills or cognitive ability, because his gesturing skills are on par with his age. Let's compare his gesture skills to his linguistic skills. In terms of phrases understood, he's at about the 14 to 15 month level. For words understood, he's at the 14-month level. So those are very close to his gesture age scores, and also basically the same as his chronological age. So his comprehension of words is where it should be for his age level. Looking at his words produced, we see his age score is 12 months. That's below both his gesture score, so probably his thinking skill level, and below his chronological age by several months. We see that John's only producing 3 different words. At the current time, we see underneath that all 3 of those words are produced in sign language. 3 words is typical for a child at 12 months of age. However, John is 15 months. So we see that in the productive language domain, John is falling behind. However, in terms of comprehension, he is on par with other children his age. Let's look at another portion of the summary sheet. You may have noticed there's some sections where we check off if a child is doing something often, sometimes, or not yet. Often being yes, sometimes, or no being they're not doing it yet. Let's take a look at the summary sheet, and we'll take a look at Emma. So up at the top, in section A, there's 3 items that a parent is asked to respond yes or no to. Does the child respond when their name is called? Do they respond to no, no, said in a harsh voice? And do they react if somebody says, there's mommy, or there's daddy, or look, mommy, look, daddy? In Emma's case, the parent said yes, she's doing all 3 of those very initial signs, beginning signs of understanding. Then in section C, there's another question, and the parents are asked to say whether their child is imitating words and if their child is going around the house labeling things. In Emma's case, the parents said no to both of those. Now, those items don't have specific age scores to them, so it's sometimes hard to interpret if the no response is okay for an 18-month-old or if that's something that we should be concerned about. But there's a page in the manual that's going to help you interpret that. And let's take a look at that page. So the first table on this page shows us the first signs of understanding. And on the very first column, it lists the child's age in months. So this is the column where you're going to want to find your child's age. So Emma, remember, is 18 months of age. So we're going to follow down that column all the way to the bottom where we see 18 months. Then the first set of numbers is for girls, and Emma's a girl, so that's what we're going to want to look at. And what these three columns tell you is the percentage of children who had either, on those three items, either none of those items were a yes or just one was a yes. The next column will tell us how many 18-month-olds, two of the items got a yes. And the last column will show us in how many cases did all three items get a yes. And we can see for 18-month-old children, 100% of them in the normative sample, the parents marked yes to all three items. Remember, in Emma's case, they were all yeses as well. So that's good. All children at 18 months should be doing those very beginning signs of understanding, and Emma was. Now let's look at the second table underneath, the starting to talk. And these were the items about, does the child imitate words and do they go around labeling things? And remember, in Emma's case, the answer was no to both of those items. Again, the first column is the child's age in months. So we're going to want to follow that down to the very bottom where we see 18 months. That's how old Emma is. And if we look across, we see that in terms of imitation, 94% of girls, the parents said yes, she is imitating a lot. And Emma was not. So this is a cause for concern. If 94% of children her age are imitating words and she is not, that means that she's delayed relative to most children. If we look across a little further, we see the labeling column. 78% of girls at 18 months are labeling, and she was not. Remember, she was a no on that. So again, the vast majority of 18-month-old girls are going around the house and labeling things, and Emma's not doing that. So again, we can interpret that no to be a cause of concern. Now, if Emma had only been 8 months old, we'd be looking up at the top of that table in the 8-month row, and we see that only 6% of girls at 8 months are going around labeling. So if Emma was only 8 months, we would not be worried, because most kids her age are not labeling. Going back to our presentation, another thing that you can do with the summary sheet is if you're working with a family that's using sign language with the child, you can evaluate the number of words the child is signing versus the number of words that they're saying. You can look at how this may shift over time, and you can see if it's in keeping with the goals that the family has for their child. Another thing you can look at on this form is the types of words the child is saying. Remember from the sample sheet that the words on this test are arranged by semantic category. So one of the things that's important to look at is the child only producing words that are labels for things? So in other words, they have a huge vocabulary of nouns, but possibly they're not doing much in terms of other kinds of words, verbs, adjectives, function words, etc. The guideline that you're going to want to use in looking at these nouns versus other words is that the ratio between the two should be somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6. So in other words, for every 10 nouns that a child produces, typically they should be producing anywhere from 3 to 6 other kinds of words, verbs, adjectives. When you think about it, you can see how important this would be in terms of a child moving from single word production to being able to combine words. Typically, when we start combining words, we're not going to be combining two nouns. We're going to be combining a noun with a verb, like daddy go, or we're going to be combining a noun with an adjective, like big dog. And if a child only has nouns in their vocabulary, it's going to delay them in moving on to word combination. Sometimes children who are deaf or hard of hearing are very noun heavy, where they have a lot of nouns in their vocabulary and very few other words. This makes it very difficult for them to move on to the stage of word combinations and to create longer and longer sentences. A form that you can either ask me for or create yourself breaks down the different words into whether they're nouns or other types of words. So on this form, you can see all the semantic categories that are on the MacArthur. And in the third column, the last column, you can see whether those words are nouns or they're other types of words. So for example, category 4, toys, those are all nouns. If you look down to category 13, which are action words, those are verbs, and so those are other sorts of words. Let's look at a form that's been completed. So in this form, we've listed the number of words that the child can produce, either in sign or spoken language, in each of the semantic categories. At the bottom, you can see that we've totaled up those other sorts of words, verbs, adjectives, function words, and we see that this child is doing 16 different other sorts of words. When we totaled up all the nouns, we see that they're producing 40 different nouns. If we divide those numbers, we get a ratio of 0.4. Remember, we're looking for a ratio between 0.3 and 0.6. So in this child's case, there's no cause for concern. They have a nice balance of nouns to other words. I want to show you one last tool that can be useful when using the MacArthur. The test publishers of the MacArthur have a website, and the link is here on this last slide. This is a great website to go to if you are trying to decide on one of a couple of things. One is it's a great website to go to if you're trying to make a list of sign vocabulary to teach parents of young children. It's also a great list to go to if you're curious as to whether the words that the child you're working with is saying or signing are typical of children their age or are unusual for children their age. Let's take a look at the website, and I'll show you some of the things that you can get. So this is the home page, and you're going to want to click on the link in the middle that says Database. Now you have a choice to look at the vocabulary in either English or Spanish, and let's look at English. We're going to look at the data set of what toddlers say, and let's just look at a specific word group rather than all the words on the test. And let's just look at the results for a specific age level. So we can go ahead and submit that, and this is a great website just to play with on your own and see all the kinds of things you can see. Now let's look at a specific type of word, and let's pick people. And let's say we want to know, what do 24-month-old children say in terms of people sorts of words? So we can submit that, and now what we're going to get is, if you look on the left-hand column, in alphabetical order, we see all the people words that are on the MacArthur test. So aunt, baby, babysitter, boy, etc. In the second column, it just reminds us that the word group that we picked was people words. Now the last column is the one of interest. What that's telling us, and we look at the top, we see M24. That reminds us we picked 24-month-olds. This column will tell us the percentage of 24-month-old children who say a given word. So looking at the very first word, aunt, we see that 50% of 24-month-olds say the word aunt. 90% of 24-month-olds say the word baby. But if we look down at the word cowboy, we see that only 14% of 24-month-olds use that particular word. So again, going back to how you might want to use this table, if you were creating an initial sign vocabulary list to teach to parents of young children, you probably would want to put the word baby on it, since the vast majority of children by the time they're 2 years old can produce that word. But you might want to leave cowboy for a little bit later, because even a child at 2 years of age, only about 14% of them know how to produce that particular word. Again, if you're wondering if your child is saying the words that are typical of a child of a given age, you can again look at this table, and there's ways in the beginning when you do the selection to sort it in terms of percentages. So you can look and see, okay, what are the commonly produced words by a 24-month-old? Well, we can see here, just scanning down our 24-month column, baby is produced by most 24-month-olds. Boy is pretty commonly produced. The child's own name is produced commonly. And then looking down at the bottom of the table, grandma and grandpa are produced by most of the kids. So this is a great way to take a look and see if the child you're working with has a vocabulary that's typical for their age or not. So again, there's lots of other ways to search the database other than what we did, and I encourage you to get into it, play around with it, and see what it has to offer. This concludes part 2 of our webinar series on assessments for young children. I hope you'll join us for part 3, where we'll be covering the other version of the MacArthur, which is called Words and Sentences.